In the final days of the Great War in Europe, May 1945, as the ghost of Hitler receded into the past and the German army dissolved into fragments, an ancient fortress still stood atop the Tyrolean Alps in Austria, Idar Castle. But inside those towering stone walls, an unbelievable scene was unfolding, an event that even Hollywood filmmakers would find hard to imagine. Perched atop a rugged rocky hill in the Tyrol region of Austria, Idar Castle, Schloss Idar, appeared like a masterpiece straight out of a medieval myth. With its sharp watchtowers piercing the mist and its thick, fortified stone walls, it had always been a symbol of invincibility. However, in the final days of World War II, this was no longer a military fortress, nor a vacation residence. It had become the strangest golden cage the Nazis had ever built. Far removed from the brutality, starvation, and stench of death at the Buchenwald concentration camp, Idar was designed to hold France's most valuable political pawns. It was a gathering place for elite minds, people who had held the destiny of a great power in their hands before it collapsed under the boots of Hitler's expeditionary forces. Inside rooms decorated with luxury, the menus remained full and the wine continued to flow, but the air was thick with tension. These prisoners of honor included Édouard Daladier, the former Prime Minister of France who signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, his bitter political rival, former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, along with General Maxime Weygand, former Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, and General Maurice Gamelin. The list even included world-renowned tennis star Jean Barotra and the sister of General de Gaulle. A historical irony unfolded: these individuals, who had once despised one another on the political stage of Paris, were now locked under the same roof. Instead of uniting to find an escape, they spent most of their time in heated arguments over who was to blame for the fall of France in 1940. Dinners at Idar Castle often devolved into endless political debates, while outside the windows, the world they once knew burned in the fires of a war nearing its end. They lived in a state of false security, protected by SS guards under the command of Sebastian Wimmer. For these VIPs, Idar Castle was a luxurious humiliation, a place where they were stripped of their power but allowed to retain their outward glamour. In early May 1945, that false peace shattered when news of Hitler's death reached the Alps. The German army, Wehrmacht, was disintegrating and surrendering in droves to the advancing Allies. However, the hatred of the SS forces had not cooled. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, had issued a final, cruel order: no prisoner should fall into the hands of the enemy alive. To the SS butchers, the French leaders at Idar were no longer bargaining chips, they were dangerous witnesses who needed to be liquidated to erase all traces. On May 4, the camp commander, Sebastian Wimmer, realizing that death was imminent if the Americans arrived, decided on a cowardly act. He and his SS guards quietly fled into the deep woods overnight, leaving the castle unguarded. The French prisoners suddenly realized they had freedom. But it was a freedom filled with horror. As dawn broke over the Alpine peaks, the French VIPs stepped out of their rooms, staring bewildered at the empty sentry posts. They were free, but Idar Castle was now like a small island in an ocean full of sharks. The forest surrounding the hill was far from quiet. It was occupied by the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, some of the most fanatical SS units who had sworn to fight to the last breath. These troops were scouring the Tyrol region to hunt down deserters and slaughter anyone in their path. To the SS, Idar Castle was now a prime target. They didn't need guards, they only needed to open fire with artillery and swarm the gates to carry out the death sentences of the French. The former prime ministers and generals, though in the twilight of their lives, quickly grasped the situation: if they left the castle to find the Americans, they would be ambushed and massacred in the woods. If they stayed without heavy weapons, they would be wiped out by the SS in a matter of hours. They began to arm themselves with the rifles and pistols left behind by the guards. The scene was ironic: the minds that once ran a superpower, men who had worn elegant suits to negotiate international treaties, were now clumsily loading ammunition, their eyes glued to the edge of the forest where the camouflage uniforms of the SS began to flicker in the distance. The atmosphere inside the castle became suffocating. The scent of luxurious banquets vanished, replaced by the smell of gunmetal and primal fear. They realized they could not hold out for long against a battle-hardened division. In a desperate effort, a brave Czech cook volunteered to bicycle through the SS encirclement to seek help from the nearby town of Wrgl. It was here that one of the strangest chains of events in history began to turn, leading to a historic handshake between an American tank captain and a German army major. The Golden Cage, atop the Alps, had now become a lonely fortress, where the most powerful men of France held their breath between two fates, a miraculous rescue on one side, and the muzzles of fanatics frantically climbing the hill on the other. Their former political arrogance gave way to the instinct for survival, as they understood that without a miracle, these poetic alpine peaks would soon become their mass grave. Amidst the ruins of the fading Third Reich, where the line between righteousness and evil was often blurred by the smoke of gunfire, one of the strangest alliances in human history was formed. It was not an agreement made at a diplomatic banquet, but a hurried handshake between two men who were supposed to kill each other, yet chose to save one another for a higher value, humanity. In the nearby town of Wrgl, Major Joseph Gangl stood before a dire situation. A veteran Wehrmacht officer, he was a true soldier who had tasted enough of the brutality of the Eastern Front. Gangl was not a Nazi. In fact, he had been secretly communicating with the Austrian resistance to find a way to save the town from the senseless destruction of the SS. When news of the French VIPs trapped at Idar Castle reached him, Gangl knew he could not stand by. If he remained idle, the SS would massacre the French prime ministers and generals, a stain that would never be washed from the honor of the German soldier. But Gangl also understood that with his handful of remaining Wehrmacht troops, he could not face an entire division of fanatical SS Panzergrenadiers scouring the woods. Gangl made a decision that would have been considered high treason if discovered. He took a white tablecloth, tied it to his Kübelwagen jeep, and drove straight toward the American lines. He did not go to surrender for his own life, but to seek the firepower necessary to save those who were technically his country's enemies. A few miles away in Kufstein, Captain John Jack Lee of the U.S. 12th Armored Division was enjoying a rare moment of rest. Lee was the quintessential American tank officer, helmet tilted to one side, a cigar never leaving his hand, and the characteristic nonchalance of a man too familiar with death. As the German jeep carrying the white flag entered the lines, American soldiers tightened their grip on their weapons. But when Gangl stepped out, gave a military salute, and requested to speak with the commander, Lee stepped forward. Using broken English and a map in hand, Gangl explained the situation. The French prime ministers are besieged. The SS is coming. I have men, you have tanks. Come with me to save them. A heavy silence followed. The American soldiers nearby looked at each other in shock. A German officer was proposing an alliance with the Americans to fight other Germans. It could be a sophisticated trap to lure American tanks into an SS ambush. But Jack Lee, with the instinct of a poker player, looked Gangl straight in the eye. He saw in the German officer not treachery, but the desperation mixed with the resolve of an honorable soldier. Lee blew out a cloud of gray cigar smoke, smirked, and gave an answer that would have stunned his superiors. All right, Fritz. Let's go get M. The order was given, and a sight unprecedented in military history began to roll. Leading the way was an M4 Sherman tank named Besotten Jenny, the American flag fluttering from its turret. Right behind it, instead of American infantry, was a truck filled with German Wehrmacht soldiers under Gangl's command, Mauser rifles still in hand, wearing the ash-gray uniforms of the Nazi military. This hybrid column drove through the contested territory where SS remnants still lurked. The sight was so bizarre that Austrian civilians along the road could only stand frozen in disbelief. They saw American and German soldiers sitting side by side on the same convoy, sharing cigarettes and scanning the brush together to spot a common enemy. Initial suspicion quickly gave way to a vital objective. Jack Lee and Joseph Gangel stood together on the vehicles, discussing tactics like true brothers in arms. Lee handled the heavy fire of the Sherman, while Gangel took charge of navigation and coordinating the German infantry to cover blind spots. As they neared the foot of Ettersburg Hill, they encountered an SS checkpoint. Without a second's hesitation, Jack Lee ordered his tank gunner to fire, while Gangel's men leaped from the truck and opened fire on the SS troops, who were screaming in rage at the betrayal. For the first time, the blood of regular American and German soldiers was spilled in the same direction against Hitler's fanatical forces. Salvation finally appeared at the gates of Itter Castle. When the French VIPs looked through the windows and saw the besotten Jenny Sherman roaring inward, followed by German soldiers wearing white handkerchiefs on their sleeves for identification, they could not believe their eyes. The rescue they had hoped for was not a massive army, but this handful of brave men, an unthinkable combination of two enemies who, only yesterday, sought to destroy each other. The handshake between Jack Lee and Joseph Gangel beneath the walls of Itter Castle marked a unique moment in time. It proved that even in the darkest moments of history, when hatred seems to consume everything, humans are still capable of recognizing what is right. That Sherman tank and those German soldiers were ready for a life-and-death struggle where they fought not for a nation, but for the human conscience. Dawn on May 5, 1945, descended upon the Alps with a beauty so still it was haunting. A thick white mist blanketed the base of Itter Castle, concealing deadly movements in the surrounding brush. Atop the ancient watchtowers, a scene that seemed surreal unfolded. American soldiers in M1 helmets and German Wehrmacht soldiers in ash-gray uniforms stood side by side, sharing final gulps of coffee and checking their ammunition clips. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the fog, the silence was shattered by the screech of machine gun fire. The strangest battle of World War II had officially begun. The attacking force was not a group of weary soldiers looking to surrender. They were approximately 150 elite gunmen from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. To them, this was not merely a military mission but an execution. They saw the American tank parked at the gate and their fellow Germans on the ramparts, whom they regarded as traitorous swine. The SS began to close the circle, using overwhelming fire from MG-42 machine guns and mortars to suppress the watchtowers. The sound of bullets striking ancient stone was deafening, and gunsmoke began to envelop the castle grounds. Inside, Captain Jack Lee coordinated the defense with astonishing calm. Standing atop the turret of the besotten Jenny, he unleashed bursts of fire from the .50 cal heavy machine gun down onto the SS squads attempting to crawl up the slope. Right beside him, Major Joseph Gangel commanded the Wehrmacht group defending the southern walls. The sight of American and German soldiers firing in rhythm at a common target was the clearest testament that human conscience had transcended brutal political ideologies. The most unexpected element of this battle was the attitude of the French VIPs. Instead of hiding in the wine cellar or armored rooms as Jack Lee had ordered, these former prime ministers and generals, all in their 60s, refused passive protection. Paul Reynaud and Edouard Daladier, once bitter political rivals, now each held a Mauser rifle, standing by high-floor windows and firing at the SS. Tennis star Jean Barotra moved nimbly between positions to resupply the soldiers with ammunition. They were no longer vulnerable politicians. In that moment, they were French soldiers fighting to reclaim their nation's honor on enemy soil. In the heat of the most ferocious stage of the battle, a terrifying whistling sound tore through the air. The SS had managed to move an 88mm anti-tank gun, the German military's most feared weapon, into a vantage point. A flash erupted. The shell exploded directly against the hull of the Sherman tank. The besotten Jenny, the symbol of hope and the only heavy firepower for the defenders, burst into a massive torch of flame. The American crew luckily escaped just before the tank exploded, but the suppressive fire was gone. The defenders were now left with only infantry rifles and an ammunition supply that was dwindling by the minute. The SS, sensing the advantage, began to cheer and surged with full force toward the main gate. A crushing pressure weighed on the shoulders of Jack Lee and Joseph Gangel. Through the thick smoke and dust, Major Gangel noticed Prime Minister Paul Reynaud leaning out of a window to observe and fire, completely exposing himself to an SS sniper lurking at the edge of the distant forest. Without a second's hesitation, Gangel abandoned his safe position and lunged toward the French politician. He roared, "Get down," and used all his strength to shove Reynaud deep into the room. At that exact moment, a sniper bullet tore through the air, striking Gangel directly in the chest. The German army major collapsed onto the stone floor of Idar Castle. His blood, the blood of a German soldier, was spilled to save the life of a French leader who was once an enemy of his nation. Gangel died fighting under the command of an American captain, against the very fanatics wearing swastikas on their sleeves. Gangel's death was not the death of a defeated man, but the liberation of a hero. He chose to sacrifice himself for a truth higher than blind loyalty to a regime. His death inspired the remaining defenders to their core. They knew that if they fell now, Gangel's sacrifice would be in vain. After Gangel's death, Jack Lee became the sole commander. He moved like a ghost between positions, encouraging the Americans, the Germans, and the French alike. He bit the end off his last cigar, his eyes hardening. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The SS had reached the foot of the walls and began tossing grenades into the courtyard. "Hang on, boys!" Lee shouted amidst the deafening explosions. "We're going to make this place their grave." American and German soldiers could no longer be distinguished by their uniforms. They shared their last magazines, bandaged each other's wounds, and looked in the same direction. Upon the stone walls of Idar Castle, a new chapter of history was being written in blood and empathy. It was no longer a war between nations, but a war between humanity and savagery. The battle continued in utter desperation until the final ray of hope appeared, the silhouette of tennis star Jean Barotra disappearing into the deep forest on a suicidal mission to find reinforcements. Could this lonely fortress hold out for one more hour as the SS prepared for their decisive assault on the main gate? Amidst the sweltering heat of gunsmoke and the acrid stench of explosives at Idar Castle, the situation had reached its most desperate point. The besotten Jenny was now nothing more than a smoking heap of scrap metal. Major Gangel had made the ultimate sacrifice, and the defenders' ammunition was dwindling with every pull of the trigger. On the other side of the stone walls, the SS had closed in on the main gate, screaming curses and preparing for a bloody massacre to end the shame of being thwarted by such a bizarre alliance. At this exact moment, a daring plan was hatched. Captain Jack Lee needed to get an urgent message to the approaching main American force, but the radio had been destroyed along with the tank. Then, a volunteer stepped forward, not a seasoned soldier, but Jean Barotra, the legendary tennis star and multiple Grand Slam winner, known as the Bounding Basque. Barotra looked Jack Lee in the eye and said simply, "I can run. I will go." For a man over 40, leaping from the high ramparts of a medieval castle to sprint across an open field surrounded by SS troops was practically a death sentence. But Barotra didn't wait for an answer. He shed his restrictive jacket, keeping only his pistol and an iron will. Under the meager cover of the final rounds fired by the Americans and Germans on the walls, Barotra leaped. As his feet hit the ground, the world around him exploded with SS machine gun fire. Bullets plowed the earth at his feet and whistled past his ears, but the Bounding Basque delivered the greatest performance of his life. He zigzagged through the brush, executing sharp pivots that no sniper could lead. Barotra vanished into the forest like a ghost, beginning the most important marathon of his life, a race against death to save the friends he had left behind in the fortress. Inside the castle, time seemed to stand still. Captain Jack Lee looked at his final magazine. He ordered the remaining men, including the Wehrmacht soldiers and the French politicians, to prepare daggers, bayonets, and anything that could be used for hand-to-hand combat. When they break the gate, aim for their throats. Lee growled, his face stripped of its usual nonchalance, leaving only the iron focus of a cornered beast. At that moment, a world-shaking explosion rang out. The SS had used explosives to breach the main gate of Idar Castle. The thick, ancient oak doors collapsed in a cloud of dust. The camouflaged forms of the SS began to flood into the courtyard with frantic screams. Jack Lee gripped his weapon tight, preparing for a life-and-death struggle that he knew the odds favored against him. But just as the first SS soldier set foot in the courtyard, another sound drowned out the gunfire, the deep, powerful roar of heavy engines. These were not German engines. It was the thunder of Sherman tanks. From the steep road leading up to the castle, the American 142nd Infantry Regiment, guided by Jean Barotra, struck like a whirlwind. The American tanks opened fire, crushing the SS machine gun nests at the forest's edge. Fresh American soldiers, fully armed, surged up the hill like an unstoppable wave. The SS, moments ago confident in their victory, suddenly became the hunted. They fled into the deep woods in a panic, but it was too late, the encirclement had flipped. Inside the castle, Jack Lee stood in silence. He saw the familiar M1 helmets emerge through the smoke and dust of the gate. The siege was broken. The Wehrmacht soldiers lowered their weapons, breathing sighs of relief because they knew they had chosen the right side. The French politicians embraced one another, tears mingling with the grime of the battlefield. When the commander of the relief force entered the courtyard, he was prepared to see a tragic scene or panic survivors. Instead, he saw a tall man, his face blackened by gun smoke, his uniform in tatters, yet standing tall and defiant. It was Jack Lee. He was nonchalantly pulling out his last cigar, lighting it, and exhaling a long plume of smoke into the air. He looked at the relief commander, smirked arrogantly, and uttered the words that would later enter military legend. "What took you so long?" That question wasn't a reproach, it was the release of hours of extreme tension. It was a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the American soldier, those who can stand before hell itself and yet never lose their pride or their sense of humor. The battle for Idar Castle ended with the victory of the American-German-French alliance. Jean Barotra survived his mad dash, and the French VIPs were returned to Paris to a hero's welcome. Jack Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and returned home as a living legend, though he rarely spoke of the event. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the battle does not lie in medals. It lies in the cemetery of the town of Wurgel, where Major Joseph Gengel rests in peace. The Battle of Idar proved that in humanity's darkest hours, when the world seems to have gone mad with hatred, humans are still capable of joining hands. A tennis star, an American tank captain, a German major, and elderly prime ministers together wrote a strange but beautiful ending to the most brutal war in history. They proved that enemies can become brothers when they fight for something more precious than national borders, humanity. The battle for Castle Idar, when weighed against colossal campaigns like the Normandy landings or the Battle of Stalingrad, is viewed as a mere spark, a local clash lasting barely 2 days within the great conflagration of World War II. Yet, as the gunsmoke cleared and the artillery began to rust with time, that spark flared into a lighthouse of humanity, illuminating one of the darkest corners of human history. It is not just a story of bullets or crumbling fortress walls, it is an anthem to the awakening of conscience, proving that even when the world is at its most frantic, humans still retain their greatest power, the right to choose to do what is right. Joseph Gengel, the soldier who chose humanity over ideology. In military history, the names of generals are often tied to glorious victories, but Major Joseph Gengel earned his place in the history books through a choice that defied every military rule. Gengel was a hero of the Eastern Front, a Wehrmacht officer who spent his youth serving under the swastika. Yet, at the fateful moment at Idar, he realized that true loyalty belonged not to a dying, brutal regime, but to his fellow man. Today, in the town of Wurgl, Austria, Joseph Gengel is honored as a national hero. A street bears his name, not to commemorate the victories he won for the Third Reich, but to remember the moment he tied a white flag to his jeep to seek out the Americans. He is the most vivid proof that a soldier can strip off the armor of hatred to don the mantle of humanity. His death, falling while shielding a French politician who was technically an enemy of his country, established a new definition of courage. It was not the courage to destroy, but the courage to protect the last shred of decency in a collapsing world. The miracle of an unlikely alliance. The Battle of Ytter remains etched in history as the only time American and German troops fought side by side as true allies. This event was like a real-life miracle, where the ash-gray of the Wehrmacht and the olive-drab of the GIs were no longer signs of mutual destruction, but colors of symbiosis. The moment Captain Jack Lee and Gengel's soldiers shared cigarettes while standing guard on the same rampart tore apart every prejudice regarding borders and ideology. It showed that, ultimately, beneath those uniforms were human beings with fears, hopes, and a belief in justice. Yesterday's enemies could become today's comrades, not because they shared political interests, but because they shared a higher purpose, stopping the primal evil of the SS and protecting innocent lives. This battle served as a profoundly human conclusion to a war that claimed tens of millions of lives. If World War II began with betrayal and hatred, it closed at Castle Ytter with a handshake between soldiers who once stood at opposite ends of the front line. It was an affirmation that brotherhood can take root even in the most barren soil of war. The eternal lesson, the power of choice. The legacy of Castle Ytter lies not in medals or old history pages. It lies in the question it poses to each of us: what will we do when the world around us begins to go mad? If the citizens of Weimar, in the story of Buchenwald, were criticized for their complicit silence, the soldiers at Ytter are celebrated for their decisive action. Jack Lee did not have to risk his life and the lives of his men to save French politicians he had never met. Joseph Gengel had even less of an obligation to save those who had declared war on his nation. But they chose to act. They chose to look at, instead of looking away. Their choice proves that every individual, regardless of their position, has the ability to change the flow of history by holding fast to their conscience. Castle Ytter is a reminder that civilization is not measured by technology or skyscrapers, but by how humans treat one another in their darkest hours. A victory for humanity. Decades have passed, and Castle Ytter has returned to its ancient, peaceful state amidst the poetic Alps. Visitors may no longer see the bullet holes or the wreckage of the besotten Jenny, but the story of the strangest battle is still passed down like a legend. It reminds us that even when humanity seems lost in hatred, empathy still has a place. Joseph Gengel, Jack Lee, and Jean Barotra together wrote a page of history where victory belonged to no army, but to humanity. It was a heroic victory filled with tears, a priceless spiritual legacy left to posterity, that regardless of the circumstances, we always have the right to choose to be a decent human being. The journey from the darkness of Buchenwald to the light of Ytter is the journey of the human heart, from complicit silence to the act of redemption. And that, perhaps, is the most important victory of the entire war.